Section 4 of Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The World Story, Volume 7, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 4, An Appeal to Caesar, 58 B.C., by T. Rice Holmes. The Helvetians of Switzerland left their homes for the wider and more fertile fields of Gaul, but were overcome and driven back by Julius Caesar. Many of the Gallic chiefs came to congratulate the conqueror. Among them were certain leaders of the Aeduans, who now appealed to him for aid. The Sequani, they said, had asked the German tribes called Suevi to come and help them against the Aeduans. The Suevi, or Suebi, had come and had conquered both Aeduans and Sequani. Ariovistus, the Suevi leader, was a bloodthirsty tyrant and was treating them with the utmost cruelty. Would not the great commander, Julius Caesar, free them from his abuse? Caesar was more than ready to grant their request. The Aeduans were allies of the Romans, and therefore he was bound to give help. Moreover, if the Germans should overrun Gaul, their next step would be into Italy. It was absolutely necessary for him to suppress Ariovistus. The Editor. Peaceful methods, however, might be tried first. The Roman army was comparatively weak. Ariovistus was master of a formidable host, and it would be foolhardy to attack him without absolute need. He had been treated with distinction by the Senate, and there was just a chance that he might listen to reason. Besides, it would be impolitic for the proconsul to levy war against the king and friend upon whom those titles had been conferred with his sanction, without preliminary diplomacy, which he must so conduct as to justify himself before his countrymen. Ariovistus was then probably in the plain of Upper Alsace, and Caesar sent ambassadors to ask him to name some intermediate spot for a conference. He, Ariovistus, told them to say that if their master wanted anything from him, he must take the trouble to come to him in person. He could not risk his safety by moving outside his own territory without his army, and to move and feed his army would involve an amount of exertion which he did not care to undergo. Meanwhile, he should like to know what business Caesar had in a country which the Germans had won by their own swords. Caesar now assumed a more peremptory tone. Ariovistus had rejected his invitation. Very good, then these were his terms. Not another man must set foot across the Rhine. The hostages of the Aedui must be restored, and Ariovistus must positively cease to molest that people or their allies. If he obeyed, Caesar would be his friend. If not, he should know how to avenge the wrongs of the Aedui. The Senate had decreed 3 years before that the governor of Gaul, for the time being, should protect the Aedui and the other allies of the Republic, and he intended to obey his instructions. Ariovistus haughtily replied that he was a conqueror, and as a conqueror he had a right to treat his subjects as he pleased. The Romans invariably acted on the same principle. He did not interfere with them. What right, then, had they to interfere with him? He would not molest the Aedui so long as they paid their tribute, but most certainly he would not give up the hostages, and if the Aedui did not pay, much good would their alliance with the Romans do them. For Caesar's threats he cared nothing. No man had ever withstood Ariovistus and escaped destruction. Let Caesar choose his own time for fighting. He would soon find out what mettle there was in the unbeaten warriors of Germany. With this message came the alarming news that a host of Suebi had appeared on the eastern bank of the Rhine, and that the Harudes were actually harrying the lands of the Aedui. Caesar, the most reticent of writers, has told us that he was seriously alarmed. The Gauls were waiting to see whether he or Ariovistus was to be master. If he suffered any reverse, they would probably rise in his rear, and between them and the Germans his army might perish. Not a moment was to be lost if the formidable Suebi were to be prevented from reinforcing the army of Ariovistus. With all possible speed, Caesar made arrangements with the Aedui, the Sequani, and the Lingones for the forwarding of supplies, and immediately put his army in motion. 3 days later, he heard that Ariovistus was hurrying to seize Vesontio, now Besançon, the chief town of the Sequani, a strong place, well stored with all munitions of war. Marching night and day at his utmost speed to anticipate him, he encamped on the outskirts and threw a strong garrison into the town. Vesontio, which now became Caesar's base, was an ideal Gallic stronghold. The town stood on a sloping peninsula, round which the Doubs swept in a curve that nearly formed a circle, while the isthmus, little more than 500 yards wide, rose from either bank into a steep and lofty hill, girt by a wall which gave it the strength of a citadel, and connected it with the town. During the short time that Caesar stayed there to collect supplies, his soldiers had plenty of opportunity for gossiping. The people of the place, and especially the traders whose business had brought them into contact with the Germans, told marvelous stories of their great strength and superhuman valor. One could not bear even to look them in the face, so terrible was the glare of their piercing eyes. The Roman soldiers were brave, but they remembered their desperate struggle with the Helvetia. They were liable to fits of panic, and they were very credulous. The idle chatter of their new acquaintances completely demoralized them. The mischief began with the tribunes, the officers of the auxiliary corps, and others who formed the personal following of the general. Many of them were soldiers only in name. Like every other Roman governor, Caesar had been obliged, for political reasons, to find places in his army for fashionable idlers and disappointed professional men who had had no experience of war and simply wanted to mend their fortunes by looting. Now that there was a prospect of real stern fighting, they began to tremble. They whispered that the campaign was not authorized by the Senate, but undertaken simply to gratify Caesar's ambition. Some invented excuses for asking leave of absence; others felt bound, for very shame, to stay; but they could not command their countenances enough to look as if they were not afraid. Sometimes, indeed, in spite of themselves, they gave way to tears. Gradually, even centurions and seasoned veterans were infected by the general alarm. Some of them, indeed, made an effort to disguise their fears. They told each other that it was not the enemy, but only the forests between them and the enemy, and the probable failure of supplies, that they dreaded. All over the camp men were making their wills, and Caesar was actually told that, when he gave the order to march, the men would refuse to obey. He immediately sent for the tribunes and centurions and gave them a severe lecture. What business had they to ask where he intended to march? It was most unlikely that Ariovistus would be mad enough to fight, but supposing that he did, what was there to be afraid of? Had they lost all confidence in themselves, all faith in their general? What had these terrible Germans ever really done? The crushing defeats which Marius had inflicted upon the Cimbri and Teutoni, the defeats which had been inflicted upon the gladiators, trained though they were in Roman discipline in the recent Servile War, gave the real measure of their prowess. Even the Helvetia had often beaten them, and the Helvetia had gone down before the legions. No doubt Ariovistus had defeated the Gauls, but what of that? He had tired them out by avoiding a battle for months, and then attacked them when they had dispersed and were off their guard. This did not mean that Germans were braver than Gauls. and Ariovistus himself must know that Roman armies were not to be trapped by such transparent devices. To talk about the difficulty of the country or the difficulty of getting supplies was downright impertinence. It was as much as to assume that the general did not know his own business. Supplies were coming up to the front from the friendly tribes, and the croakers would soon see that their alarm about the forests was absurd. As for the story that the army was going to mutiny, he did not believe it. Armies did not mutiny unless generals were incapable or dishonest. His integrity had never been called in question, and the late campaign proved that he could command. Anyhow, on the very next night he intended to march, and if nobody else would follow him, he would go on with the 10th Legion alone, for it, at all events, was faithful to its commander. This vigorous little speech had a marvelous effect upon the troops. From despair, their spirits bounded to the highest pitch of confidence, and they were only impatient to cross swords with the enemy. The men of the 10th, flattered by Caesar's trust in them, sent him a message of thanks through their officers, while the other legions asked theirs to tell him that they were sorry for what had occurred. At the hour which he had fixed, Caesar struck his camp. He left a detachment to hold Vesontio. Before him all was unknown, but he had full faith, and Diviciacus undertook to be his guide. To avoid the broken wooded country between Besançon and Montbéliard, he made a circuit northward and eastward of about 50 miles, and then threading the pass of Belfort, debouched into the plain of the Rhine, and pushed on rapidly past the eastern slopes of the Vosges till he reached a point within 22 miles of the German encampment. He has not told us where he formed his own camp. Probably it was on the river fetched between Ostheim and Gamar. Ariovistus, who was on the north, sent messengers to say that, as Caesar had come nearer, he had no objection to meeting him. Caesar accepted his proposal, and the conference was fixed for the 5th day following. Ariovistus, who knew that Caesar's cavalry were weak, pretended to be afraid of treachery from the legions, and insisted that they should each bring with them a cavalry escort only. Caesar was unwilling to raise difficulties, but as all his cavalry were Gauls, and he did not care to trust his safety to them, he mounted the 10th on their horses. The place of meeting was a knoll rising above the plain, nearly equidistant from the Roman and the German camp. Caesar stationed the bulk of his escort about 300 yards off. Ariovistus did likewise, and each rode up with 10 horsemen to the knoll. Ariovistus had stipulated that they should hold the conference without dismounting. Caesar began by reminding Ariovistus of the honors which the Senate had conferred upon him, and afterwards repeated the demands which he had already made through his envoys on behalf of the Aedui. Ariovistus replied that he had only crossed the Rhine in response to Gallic appeals. The country which he occupied in Gaul had been formerly ceded to him by Gauls, and it was not he who had attacked them, but they who had attacked him. He had overthrown their entire host in battle, and if they cared to repeat the experiment, he was ready to fight them again. As for the friendship of the Romans, it was only fair that he should get some solid advantage out of it, and if he could only retain it by giving up the tribute which he received from his subjects, he would fling it aside as readily as he had asked for it. He had entered Gaul before the Romans. Caesar was the first Roman governor who had ever passed beyond the frontier of the province. What did he mean by invading his dominions? That part of the country belonged to him just as much as the province belonged to Rome. Caesar talked a great deal of the titles which the Senate had bestowed upon the Aedui, but he knew too much of the world to be imposed upon by such shams. The Aedui had not helped the Romans in the war with the Allobroges, and the Romans had not stirred a finger to help their brethren against himself. He had good grounds for suspecting that the friendship which Caesar professed for him was another sham, a mere blind, under cover of which Caesar was plotting his ruin. He happened to know what was going on in Rome, and there were prominent men there who would be glad to hear of Caesar's death. If Caesar did not withdraw from his country, he would expel him by force of arms. But if he would only go away and leave him in peace, he would show his gratitude. Caesar quietly answered that it was impossible for him to go back from his word or to forsake the allies of his country. And he added, if history were to be appealed to, the claim of the Romans to supremacy in Gaul was better founded than that of the Germans. He was still speaking when a soldier rode up and warned him that a number of Germans were edging up towards the knoll and stoning his escort. Riding back to his men, he withdrew them without attempting to retaliate, for though he was confident that his splendid legion could easily beat the Germans, he was determined not to give them any pretext for accusing him of foul play. Exasperated by this outrage, the Romans became more than ever impatient for battle. 2 days later, Ariovistus requested Caesar to meet him again, or else send one of his generals. Caesar saw no reason for further discussion, and did not care to expose his lieutenants to the tender mercies of a treacherous barbarian. But he sent his interpreter, Trucillus, and a man called Medius, whom, as he believed, Ariovistus could have no motive for injuring. They were instructed to hear what Ariovistus had to say, and bring back word. The moment he saw them, Ariovistus flew into a passion. "Why have you come here?" he shouted. "To play the spy?" And when they attempted to explain, he cut them short and put them under arrest. On the same day, he made a long march southward, and halted about 6 miles north of Caesar's camp, at the very foot of the Vosges. He had conceived a daring plan. Next morning, his column ascended the lower slopes, marched securely along them past the Roman army, and took up a position 2 miles south of Caesar's camp. As he looked up at the huge column winding leisurely by, Caesar saw that he was being outmaneuvered. To send the legions up the hillside would be to court destruction, and he could only wait, a passive spectator, while Ariovistus was cutting his communications and barring up the road by which he expected his supplies. Next day, Caesar formed up his army immediately in front of the camp, under the protection of his artillery. Ariovistus might attack if he liked, but if he attacked, it would be at his peril. If he declined the challenge, the legionaries would be assured that the Germans were not invincible. Ariovistus remained where he was. On each of the 4 following days, Caesar offered battle, but the enemy would not be provoked into leaving their camp. Cavalry skirmishes indeed took place daily, but without any decisive results. The Germans had light-armed active footmen who accompanied the cavalry into action, each one of them selected by the rider whom he attended. They were trained to run by the horses' sides, holding on to their manes, and if the troopers were forced to retreat, they supported them and protected the wounded. As the infantry remained obstinately in their camp, and it was necessary for Caesar to win back communications with his convoys, he resolved to take the initiative. Forming his legions in 3 parallel columns, prepared at a moment's notice to face into line of battle, he marched back to a point about 1,000 yards south of Ariovistus's position, and there marked out a site for a camp. One column fell to work with their spades, while the other 2 formed into lines to protect them. Ariovistus sent a detachment to stop the work, but it was too late. The fighting legions kept their assailants at bay, and the camp was made. 2 legions with a corps of auxiliaries were left to hold it, and the other 4 returned to the larger camp. Next day, Caesar led his men into the open, but not far from his camp, and again offered battle. Ariovistus again declined the challenge, but as soon as the legions had returned to their entrenchments, he made a determined effort to storm the smaller camp, and only drew off his forces at sunset. The Romans had suffered as heavily as the Germans, but Caesar now learned from prisoners that the enemy had been warned by their wise women, whose divinations they accepted with superstitious awe, that they could not gain the victory unless they postponed the battle until after the new moon. Caesar saw his opportunity. He waited till the following morning, and then leaving detachments to guard his two camps, he formed his 6 legions as usual in 3 lines, and marched against the enemy. They had no choice but to defend themselves. Their wagons stood in a huge semicircle, closing their flanks and rear, and as they tramped out, their women stretched out their hands and piteously begged them not to suffer their wives to be made slaves. The host was formed in 7 distinct groups, each composed of the warriors of a single tribe. As the Romans were numerically weaker than their opponents, the auxiliaries were drawn up in front of the smaller camp to make a show of strength. Each of the legati was placed at the head of a legion in order that every one might feel that his courage and action would not be overlooked. Caesar commanded the right wing in person, and noticing that the enemy's left was comparatively weak, directed against it his principal attack, in the hope of overwhelming it speedily, and thus disconcerting the rest of the force. But before the Romans in the front ranks could poise their javelins, the Germans were upon them, and they had barely a moment to draw their swords. Quickly stiffening into compact masses, the Germans locked their shields to receive the thrusts. But some of the Romans flung themselves right on to the phalanxes. They tore the shields from the grasp of their foes and dug their swords down into them, and after a close struggle they broke the formation, and their weapons got freer play. The unwieldy masses, unable to maneuver or to deploy, reeled backward, dissolved, and fled. But the Roman left, overpowered by numbers, was giving ground. Young Publius Crassus, son of the celebrated Triumvir, who was stationed in command of the cavalry outside the battle, saw the crisis and promptly sent the third line to the rescue. The victory was won, and the whole beaten multitude fled towards the Rhine. But the Rhine was some 15 miles away. The Il had first to be crossed, and in that weary flight many fell under the lances of the cavalry. Only a few, among whom was Ariovistus, were lucky enough to swim the river or find boats. Caesar, in the course of the pursuit, came upon his interpreter, who was being dragged along in chains by his captors, and had only escaped death by the accident that, on drawing lots, they had decided to postpone his execution. There is nothing in Caesar's memoirs more full of human interest than the passage in which, breaking his habitual reserve, he tells us of the joy he felt on seeing this man, for whom he had the greatest respect and regard, alive and unhurt. It gave him, he tells us, a pleasure as great as he had felt in gaining the victory. End of section 4. This recording is in the public domain.